And welcome to John and James Live. My name is John Hastings. I'm with my co-host, Mr. James Celo, and our special guest today to talk about the truth behind men's mental health. We have Mr. Luke Holder, chef director within the award-winning Limewood Hotel, and a Mr. Steve Rockey, and you are HR vet leading a charge on culture and well-being, because you guys met up, didn't you, at a recent event? Is that right?
Yeah, well, we used to work together as
right, yeah.
Steve was part of the Pigs, and then as we separated as a hotel group, Steve went in one direction, I went in the other, and we've still kept in contact as friends and work colleagues, I suppose, or industry colleagues.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Nice. And what was the event that you went to with James? Because it was about a men's mental health event. I think that's how you got in contact with James. How did that come about? And is this on the agenda within the hospitality space at the moment, or is this a general societal thing?
The event was called Men in Mind, and it was kind of curated actually by Limewood, and it was it is that sort of topic of conversation that does seem to be becoming more and more prevalent, and you know, as happened to us, oddly, actually, Luke, when the four of us kind of got together just to sort of talk about, you know, the question, what's it like to be a man in society today, and how is that different or not from how it used to be? I mean, the four of us just chatted for hours. Like, we could have just, you know, done the event down the pub, because when you start to talk about something that it's never really been talked about, has it? Because it's not like it's never been sort of something that's never really been spoken about. But actually, if you get a group of blokes together and you start talking about what's it like, actually everyone's got a different story. Everyone's got a slightly different slant of it. The sort of society has changed, and the role of a man is different. But that can be family to family, and depending on the job and what your partner or your wife does, or it's much more nuanced, perhaps, than maybe it
and I think as well, Steve, you know, you and I both sit in an industry that's probably been quite slow to normalise, I suppose. Sure. Still sort of quite, you know, for a long period of time, it was quite Victorian and toxic in its management. Kitchens were very heavily male orientated, with a very competitive edge to them, if not quite toxic. And I think Steve and I have both been on one side of the fence trying to change the culture within hospitality, within kitchens in particular, and try and make them, you know, safe spaces, normal spaces with normal working conditions, normal working hours. And if you make mistakes, like you might do if you're working in any other industry, maybe not necessarily having the chef turn around and give you a good bawling out with lots of explicitives in there as well. And you know, one of the big challenges for hospitality that, you know, I can absolutely vouch that Steve and I were on the front fence for, is trying to change working conditions and working hours and getting people to be paid for the hours that they work. That was in response to the fact that I think particularly after Brexit and post-COVID, you know, the challenge to recruit staff and retain staff is a really important factor for hospitality, because it's a people-led business. You know, we are people-led. You know, we have a 3 Ps, which is people, product, profit. You know, don't get them the wrong way around. Otherwise, your business can be tapped out quite quickly. So, but through that, you know, we started to realise there is some sort of big issue bubbling under the surface of where men feel, or where men struggle to feel their place in society anymore. You know, it's about allowing competitiveness to still be in the workplace without it becoming detrimental to the workspace and to the individuals involved. And that's been I suppose when we all got round the table, we all started realising that was happening in all of our industries, and it's a challenge. And when you start looking under the surface at some of the statistics of the biggest killers of men between 19 and 24 is suicide, and then you had Gareth Southgate coming out with his Lost Boys report, and or was commenting on the report that came out, the Lost Boys report. And you realise statistically men are falling behind everybody on every metric, on motivation, earnings, education, and their place. So it was a conversation, I think, that was taken casually that formed into actually having some structure and was worthwhile getting a few people around the table to discuss.
Yeah. Go for it,
What did you feel the kind of response on the evening was, guys, both to you and Steve? Luke, what was your sense afterwards? Do you feel that there was some impact? I mean, there were a mix of men and women there, which was interesting. I kind of assumed that would all be men, but they brought their partners along as well. So what was your sort of sense of how the evening went and the feedback? Interesting.
I thought, absolutely that. I think it was important to have women in the room, young people and old people. We had a few people in the audience asking questions, particularly young men, about how they view it all. I think what I took away from it really was everybody's aware that there's a need to sort of unpack this in a bit more detail. But how and what are the contributing factors, I think was what came out of the audience that I thought was really interesting, and social media's role in it. And I think in some ways, I think the devaluing of hard work from a social media perspective, I found quite interesting. And then who's responsible? There's a lot of people saying it's the schools, it's the parents, it's the, where have we let people down? Where have we, lost the ball, I suppose. And we also had, another speaker from Southampton Football Club talking about the challenges of young men coming through the academy systems. And, it's a 1% game, the Premier League, and the top 1% of the people who get into football get there. So there's a lot of disappointment being dished out. And I think where I concluded was, have we failed in building resilience in people? Have we failed to reframe the narrative around mistakes instead of awarding a 15th place finish as a winner? Is there anything wrong with saying, actually, there is only ever one winner and everybody else is a loser? And that's fine, because you win at different points in life. You don't win every single time, and I think maybe through all of our avenues of trying to be fair through school, work, relationships, and trying to pat people on the back, saying, no, it's fine, you can, everybody's a winner. We've created a very unresilient and unprepared for life level of people entering the workplaces as grown-up adults, who then really struggle. And I can tell you right now, a lot of my role currently is mentoring young men into adulthood, to be able to say, the world's not, not against you, but the universe marches on relentlessly anyway.
Yeah. What do you think, Steve?
Same question for you, Steve.
Are you seeing it as, what have you seen the changes in the last, say, 20, 30 years in your working life? And what is the changing in dynamics that would lead to people maybe not feeling as good, or the changes for men in society?
It's I would guess from a working perspective, you have seen tangibly a lot more, particularly young men, if I think kind of latterly in my career, but not necessarily exclusively, but sort of young people who they just need more of a helping hand, like whether it's a little bit of guidance, or sometimes it's a lot of guidance. It's a bit of motivation or a massive kick up the arse. There's just more of your job is, and from a line manager's perspective, if you're managing a team, I think team management now wholly different. It is how do you manage and motivate and encourage and develop those individual personalities, maybe even more than you ever had to, because people might be a bit lost or don't know exactly what it is they're doing, or in terms of either their life or their career. And so your job becomes much more around helping people to kind of manage those things. Whereas I would reflect in, I'm a solid Generation X, right? So these are decisions that you still had no idea what the output was going to be. You had no idea whether you were making the right decision or the wrong decision, but you sort of weirdly enjoyed the mess of it all. And I think what you see now is young people who are kind of maybe a bit more petrified of getting it wrong, whatever wrong is, and not seeing the really long term of it all. And whatever decision you make now isn't the be all and end all, and you can change, and you can do this for a period of time and go and do something else. And I guess in some ways the total flip of that is that the world of work has also changed, and young people can make a lot of money out of doing roles that didn't exist when Luke and I were kicking around, and so therefore how it is you can go about doing your work has also changed slightly. And so I think there is this, you've got a generational issue where you've got our sort of generation now in sort of more senior roles within businesses, and we have grown up in a very particular way, and we have very particular expectations, particularly around grit and resilience, because that's the those are big building blocks of our generation, and we also need to get our heads around the fact that doesn't exist, and so we need to step in more in order to do that. Whereas I would reflect, kind of growing up, there was a lot more stepping out of people, and just you got pushed onto the football field, and now you're here, so now you've got to do something, and now you've got to encourage people to get to kind of step up onto the football pitch, kind of thing, as an analogy. But yeah, it is a very different time, and I we had an hour at the Limewoods kind of event, and we could have gone on for hours, and it would have been great to have kind of come out there with one thing, let alone three things. One thing that whoever it was, whether you were on the panel or whether you were in the audience, what's the one action that you're going to take away? It would have been great to have got to maybe that spot, but we were never going to get to that in an hour, because the subject is so rich, I guess, in terms of facets to it, that it's very difficult to kind of nail down the one particular thing that actually in society, if we change that, then that would solve it. That's clearly never. I
think one of the great things for me was there was a young lad there. I think he's a PT that works at Limewood.
Yes.
I forget his name, and I was so impressed. I mean, he was stood behind me, and he would ask questions, and the maturity, and he was, I think, in his early 20s. And what the great thing about it was, it enabled everybody in the room to get some perspective over lads of his age, that we're not, we're all of a similar age, give or take sort of 10 years, whatever. But, we can be in a situation where we just assume, because of our generation, that all kids are a particular way, that they're all going to struggle in these situations, that they've all got this one particular attitude. And become quite polarized and a little bit jaundiced in our view because of our generation and how we were brought up, and nothing was given to us on a plate, and there wasn't YouTube, and we didn't have this attitude that sense of entitlement, I think, is banded around quite a bit. And that can be a challenging situation, because that then gets you into a situation where you can just categorize sort of off the cuff, and it'd be a throwaway comment that all kids are that way inclined. Now, this lad, he was clearly not, and whether that's how he'd been brought up, the situation, but it was just the voice that enabled everybody to get that level of perspective. and that we're not just sort of generalizing and making a stereotype or a caricature of kids coming through and what that looks like. Am I right that you guys got a sense of that as well?
Yeah, for
absolutely.
sure.
I also felt that he was, quite the opposite. He wanted, well, exactly as you said, but quite the opposite to the way we were thinking is, he wanted us to give the younger people more responsibility and more accountability. And I think, in some ways, we failed a generation by over pampering for them and over, worrying about it. And, as parents, you're back and forth with the push and pull over a phone, but really that's a fear born from within us. We want to know where you are, so we want to give you a phone. But actually, when we were kids, we liked the anonymity of not knowing where we were. Our parents didn't care. It's like, well, they cared, but they were like, get out, go out, and enjoy yourself, and be back before the sun comes down. I find that conversation within my own household a little bit more like, well, where are the kids going? Make sure your phone's on, make sure it's charged, make sure you've got your locator on it. And I found with that young man, he was sort of like, actually, as parents, you're not giving us enough responsibility. You're not giving us enough accountability and enough trust. And there's something to be said, and I think, James, we might have touched on this on the night of the 24-hour news cycle coming in at a certain age for us that has driven a lot of paranoia. Whereas I suppose when we were kids, the weird house at the end of the road, don't go knock on his door because the guy's a bit, whatever, has turned into there's a paedophile on the edge of every corner and they're after your kids unless you've got the phone on them, they're going to end up raped, murdered and whatever. And we've got to sort of see that we have some responsibility ourselves to the parenting that we've delivered and the schooling that we've delivered for these kids. And really, you're right, they're not all lost souls. They're willing, but just trust them, give them more accountability, give them more responsibility. And actually, we probably should have done that a bit earlier, so we can see how resilient they really are. Because you're right, Steve, we do have to be there for them a bit more now because we built that around them from such an early age. That we're here for them. Whereas we should have just shoved them out the door and said, go and enjoy yourself and we'll see you in a few hours later, and I'm actively as a parent now trying to row backwards a little bit and try and do that with my kids and placate my wife's fears about them not having their phone on them and say, there's something to be said about not knowing where you are, not being traceable and trackable 24/7. We've sort of burdened our children with that.
In a weird way, it stops. It sort of ironically stops grit and resilience, doesn't it?
Yes, completely. Yeah, because you haven't gone out and your mate's come off his bike and he looks like he's cut his face, and how are we going to deal with this? We're hours away from going home. And you can't just pick up the phone and go, oh, Dad, somebody's fallen off a bike. Don't worry, we'll be in the car. We'll come round. We'll pick him up. We'll take him to get cleaned up. You would just sort of like grin and bear it and hopefully go and find 5p on the floor and go buy him a can of Coke or something. We don't even have cash anymore to be able to for them to find lying on the street.
Yeah.
Could we pose it in a different way and see it that it might not be about grit and resilience? Could we say that maybe life was easier back then? So if we look at it maybe in an objective way, we could say a man in the 1960s could have a very average job, get paid an average wage, be able to afford a house. It would be more community orientated. It was less competitive. The population was less. There wasn't a paradox of choice. You'd meet somebody who lived maybe close to where you lived now. There was less isolation. There was the social lubricant of alcohol. Yeah, that was a big thing. But, you would probably get a job from someone, whereas nowadays, it's hyper competitive. Most people, under the age of 40, they're going to struggle to ever buy a property depending on where you live, depending on the wages. So that's like out of the window. When it comes to the dating market, it's online dating. If you're not in the top like 10% of most attractive men that most of the women are looking for, then that's gone. That's out of the window for you. You're isolated because all the pubs are shut and that culture's gone. So you can't afford to do anything. You're not really meeting a mate. And then you go into a job where you're thinking, I can work 40 hours a week and I still can't even cover my bills. And we're saying that they're not resilient. Is that resilience, or is that reality?
Well, I think there's one other caveat to as a filter to put over that as well is online. I think there has been a decimation. You took back to our, when we were young, you would be, if you didn't do well at school, you'd go and take an apprenticeship with a craftsperson. You'd learn hands and heart on how to do that. Or there was always labour work to do. But I think there has been a decimation of just doing labour or manual work as being something below people now. And I think that is a challenge, because really people need to have purpose, need to feel wanted and need to feel like they're contributing to something. This is a bit of a throwback, but it always sticks in my mind of when Thatcher got rid of the mines. What she actually destroyed there was the sense of purpose for working class people. It wasn't about making loads of money and having an abundance of wealth. You could live in a council house and never pay it off, and you'd still feel that you were contributing. You get up, you go to work, you have a little community around you. The communities have become too wide, too far, too spread. We've lost any sort of moral compass within society now, because there's no more, religion's not the core of what we do anymore, and you can take your views from that which way. But I think having a sense of purpose and a sense of drive, but when they're on social media and they're seeing people who could or could not be making £1 million a month by just posting content, you sort of devalued the fact that you stood on roads and paving stones and taking water from the tap from hard work that's gone before. And I think you're absolutely right that it's probably become more difficult and more challenging, but where do we find the sense of purpose for people? I think that's really the core. You're absolutely right that back then you knew your society around you, you knew how to engage with the social lubricant of alcohol to find partners and companionship. And now if you're not in those small percentiles of success, you can feel totally lost. And if you are then going to pick up something that's become demonized and seen as low level, if you're a kitchen porter, or if you're a manual laborer, they're not seen as necessarily as important as it were when you were mining and you were fueling the electricity that everybody enjoys. That gave you a sense of purpose.
Yeah. What do you think, Steve? Because I watched the top guy in AI was talking about the future, and he said they asked him, what would you recommend your kid to do as a job? And he said, definitely be a plumber. And he said, go down that road. Most jobs are going to be maybe taken over, but plumbing's going to stay around for a while. But do you concur with that, Steve, in terms of what Luke was saying there?
I think your point was interesting about about how the world is very different, and the things that were on offer are now potentially either different, not on offer, or on offer in a completely different way.
Yeah.
And how does that impact at whatever scale of resilience or grit? And it's a great challenge. And you would arguably say that the world is a little bit more, maybe a lot more tougher now than it was kind of back in the day, and therefore that has to breed a certain grit and resilience within young people and young men. So yeah, that's definitely a kind of a good point. But at the same time, all of that energy has to be channeled towards something, or else it can get channeled in all sorts of different directions, nefarious or not. So I think Luke's point is right in that it's a purpose, or having a purpose to focus on and to channel that energy towards, I would say, from my perspective, is totally right. Like, because if you don't, you end up floundering.
Yeah. How can we cultivate that purpose then, Steve? How can we, are we saying that people 30, 40 years ago had loads of purpose, or were they just in survival mode and their community was something that was the fun part? That was what life was all about, relationships. Now we're in a world where we're so disconnected that we're working to self-maximize ourselves, and we're sort of missing the point of the relationship.
Did we not have the bandwidth, and was that a luxury that we could ill afford? You know, we were just in survival mode, that we didn't have the time on our hands to be able to think about these particular things.
I would, in some way, I think just your world has just expanded massively. So your world would have been your town or your street or your village or whatever it was. Your community would have been, you know, and all of this would have played out, but it would have played out in a much more kind of micro sort of level. You would have never been able to message someone in the US who said something that annoyed you, so therefore you get to put a comment that didn't exist. So everything kind of played out in a much more, in a smaller kind of way. And so your purpose was that. And I guess what's happened over time is the world of work and the types of work and the expansion of work and the things that the world produces and where they're produced are all now much, things are a lot more different now than they were in
they're more transparent, the reality of where stuff comes from.
Yeah. And so you, rather than having a purpose of that might have been on a sort of a more micro level, I think the opportunities, I guess, to get involved in things are much bigger now than they ever have been. And I think that's changed people's ability to focus on the 6 inches in front of their face and where those are. I wouldn't necessarily say that you're in kind of like survival mode in the sort of the 60s and 70s. It just would have been the size of the community that you're in would have just been by default smaller, and now it's much more connected and oddly much more disconnected, because you don't know who your next door neighbor is anymore. But you can drop a comment to a guy who's in the US sitting in his house over there, spouting whatever he wants to spout, and so in one hand it's easier to find something that can give you purpose, because there are many more different parts of that within society as a whole, and as a result of choice of that, it's extremely difficult to find the thing that ticks your box.
Yeah,
because
just anecdotally, I want to bring it back to a conversation that I had with somebody. I wouldn't call him a friend of mine, but it's a guy that I've met a couple of times for a coffee, and he said something really interesting to me. He said, James, he said, I feel like I need a group of guys that I can talk to on a much deeper, meaningful level. He said, I've got my mates that I go down the pub with, have a beer, and we sort of take the piss out of each other, and we have these kind of surface conversations, maybe about football, maybe about politics or whatever, but we don't get into the good stuff. He said, it's like I need to create, and he was asking me if I could do something, with him, create a group of guys that could actually talk on that sort of level. Now, it seems like counterintuitive, doesn't it, that you can't have those deep and meaningful emotional conversations with the guys you've known for 20, 30 years, and yet you can have that conversation with a complete stranger.
Sure.
So what is it in a men's mentality or a man's mentality that disables him from having a conversation like, and look, this is a gross generalization, I get it, but that was one particular conversation. So I'm using it anecdotally, that we can't have those deep, meaningful conversations with another bloke that we've known for a long time? What do you reckon? Luke?
It's a difficult one, because I think men in groups, there's your perceived status within your group, and your life, and we're not. I think if I go back, to and this is another broad generalization, but back to how men operate in team groups. So whether we were, hunting or gathering or sailing around the world, or within a football team, or even within any type of work, there can be an unspoken hierarchy that sort of settles, isn't there? It's like, right, I'll be on the net, you've got the spear, I'll stand over here and tell you where to go, left and right. Same on a football field, someone takes the ball and generates the play from that moment, takes a leadership role in that sense. So I think it is a opening up of your inner self to your peers around you can sometimes be seen as a weakness, particularly in toxic environments. So if I take this to my own career, in the kitchens I was in the very beginning of my career, if you were to show weakness, or God forbid you shed a tear due to the fact you've been working 16, 17 hours, you haven't been eating properly, you've been under a hell of a lot of pressure, and you made a mistake, and everybody else, rounded on you because you've brought the team down, they're not necessarily the people, I'm going to open up to. My own group of friends who I also don't really want to dig into that, because when I opened up, or that level of my emotional self was exposed, I was exposed for it, as a sign of weakness. So actually opening up to a neutral person gives you the opportunity to explore that level of emotion without it becoming a toxic part of your life. So if I was to relate that to how I manage the kitchen today, to how I was managed coming through it. So I see, let's just say Billy, for example, it's just a pseudo name for anybody in the kitchen. He's made a mistake, right? Say he's overcooked the steak or undercooked the steak or whatever. It would be, in my youth, that would be like, are you effing kidding me? Effing mess this up. This is costing us a fortune. And then you've got to rebattle your composure to keep going during that service and still feel motivated to come back in the next day and take all of that, you've let everybody down home with you. Whereas what I'll turn and do now is, try and disarm that fear and say, you messed up the steak. Well, you've got to mess up another 50 before you start getting it right. But we're here to support you to get that through, right? And to not allow the rest of the team to round on him. And that is something that comes quite naturally for men. There's the weak one. Let's point him out. Right, let's get him.
Yeah.
You've got to up your game. Now, this isn't about saying that we have to accept mediocrity. Ultimately, the hotel that we're at and the food that we, the senior chefs in the kitchen have to protect the guest expectation. You're going to come and pay 50 quid for a main course. There is an expectation. We're not going to serve you an undercooked steak, an overcooked steak, or hopefully not make you wait 45 minutes while we correct those mistakes. Right?
Yeah.
Because that is unacceptable for the guest who's paying for that premium price. So what we have to try and do is curate a culture within the kitchen where failing is part of the journey moving forward, that we've all been there, that every single one of us has made a mistake, and that, when I was growing up, you felt like these senior chefs were born with God's gift to cook. They were just a natural talent. They never made any mistakes. That was the sort of the image around them. But in reality, every single one of them's had a good bollocking at one point in their life and overcooked something, undercooked something, but nobody wants to admit to that. So we have to change and the culture. And as Steve said, I think Steve and I have a certain age where we've transitioned with hospitality from one foot in the past to one foot in the future, from that group rounding, group humiliation, toxic masculinity of failure within the team dynamic, to say, actually, we're still at a very high level here. The business would accept, more of the failure, as in, it's cost us a bit more while we've been training this guy, but we haven't also, or girl, we haven't made them feel like a loser for doing it. It's empowering it as part of their journey forward. And that takes more mentoring, and that takes a real dynamic shift within the culture of your senior team. And bearing in mind, most of my senior team grew up in that type of environment, and we've had to, sandpaper away at the edges of these hard chefs to say, this isn't going to help, because ultimately that hard-nosed, uncompromising group mentality ultimately leaves you isolated within the kitchen, because people don't want to work for you nowadays. Nobody is going to accept that as a modern employee. But there are modern employees who want to come in, who want to up their game, who want to be competitive, who want to cook at the highest level, who like the challenge, but just don't need all the BS that goes with it and the group humiliation and the undermining of it. And that's where, we look back in the past and we think, well, why have we got a generation of chefs coming through with that mentality? Because those people who didn't have that mentality were lost to the industry, and that left us short-staffed. They were like, well, I'm not going to work in here. This is awful. And we lost so many good cooks, or potentially good cooks, due to the, survival of the fittest attitude. And I think now we have to make people feel valued, feel worth it. So you take sickness, for example, everyone says, oh, the sick note generation that's coming through, they're always, well, actually, when you make them feel part of a team, and they know that actually, if I phone in sick today, I know that everybody else is having a harder day and is picking up that work, they're actually quite committed to coming in and supporting it. But on the other side, if they are genuinely mentally fatigued for whatever reason, the rest of the team have to know that we're all there to support him or her like we would you. And that comes down to, group culture within businesses and changing the dynamic of what's expected around us without compromising on standards for the guests and for what we expect from a technical point of view in the kitchen.
Yeah. And
Steve,
what do you think, Steve, on that one? Because it's a bit of a holistic view, Steve. Are we being a bit hard on ourselves? Because, in the last sort of 100 years, we've gone from sort of 1 billion to 8 billion people. We've gone from like horse and carriage to flying people to the moon. We're talking about developments in HR, all of these job roles in this industry. It's all, even the idea of having restaurants, from, killing off the French aristocracy, is very new. This whole area is so new. Is it just part of this evolution of modern capitalism? Is that really what it is? People are, angry in business because, it's cutthroat. And if they don't produce and somebody's making a mistake, you're going to lose profit. You're going to lose customers. You're going to lose your job. Because if somebody came to me, Steve, and I was a single business owner, and one person said they're being honest and they say, look, I suffer from anxiety and depression, and then I've got another candidate who doesn't, I'm more likely to pick the candidate who doesn't suffer from anxiety and depression, because it's not because I don't care for that person or I don't want them to be well. It's just that you got to feel like you need to survive in this cutthroat game. So how does that play out, Steve? Give me all the answers.
Go.
If I had them. All I would say is the person who either doesn't think they've had anxiety or depression, or is saying they haven't had anxiety, depression at some stage throughout the course of their life, is going to be anxious.
It will come,
and it's going to be depressed. So it's
lying.
It's fairly short-termist, I guess. To go back to the other about, and I'll go on to that, about who do you speak to and your mates, and this kind of trust thing. There is something in there about having. I have I have friends who I will go and hang out with if I want to do really dumb stuff, who I want to listen to all of their absolute drivel and nonsense that makes me laugh. And then I have friends who actually, if I want to go out and have a proper conversation with, I'll go and have a proper conversation. But there is something weird about the fact that, and something powerful, I guess, about the fact that a group of men who do not know each other could actually all get in a room and have a very intimate and powerful conversation. And there's something in that for sure. And there is something in there around, looking weak, whatever that is, kind of in front of a group of mates in the pub. There is something in that, but it's also important to have people around you that you can, and they can as well, dip in and dip out, depending on what that particular person's need is at that time. So there's definitely something in that. In terms of hiring and people and the nuances of that whole people management side, I mean, if there was a silver bullet, my God, after 25 years, I might have at least have scratched the surface of it. But there is always something around fairness and consistency. There's something in and around providing or having a sense of purpose and spending time generally talking to people, and being interested and being interesting in what it is they do, and interested in what it is they do and what makes them tick. I completely understand the point that, in a short term, as a short-term decision, you would potentially prioritize employing someone who didn't come and present as something that you perceive to be a problem. That I kind of get that. At the same time, it's extremely short-termist because life's life. And at some stage over the course of someone's employment and therefore their life, things are going to go wrong. Things are going to go right, but things are also going to go wrong, which are going to impact them in an adverse and negative way. And if your culture is that in your business that you don't give a shit about that, you'll just go and find another one. That's fine. That's your choice to have a culture like that. But from a longevity perspective, you soon get a reputation of the type of business that you work in, and will attract only one particular type of person. So you almost end up pigeonholing yourself. An analogy I can give you, I do a lot of sailing. I do a lot of sailing on the south coast in the Solent. I know the boats that I'm never going to sail on because I know that the owners are a particular type of owner and they treat their crew in a particular way. And I'm never going to go and sail on those boats. And I'm a good sailor. So you sort of think, well, if that's how it is in that particular business, then that's not me. That's not my gig. There's plenty of other boats out there that I can go and sail on. And so I think if you want to only select people who don't present to you as being an immediate problem, you're on a short-term hiding to nothing. And if that's your particular business plan, then happy days. But no one made a lot of money in a really short space of time doing anything legal, I suspect. So, there's not much longevity in it. And so it's about finding people who get what you get, who believe in what it is you believe and want to join the journey that you're on. And at various stages, they'll hop on, and at various stages along that, they'll hop off. And that's probably a much more longer term sustainable way to look at managing people over the course of someone's career.
That was a very HR answer. I like that, Steve.
You did well, Steve.
You are good, aren't you? Jesus.
I've got it.
Well done, mate. Nailed it. So we've got a comment from another Steve, Steve Whittle. I believe that people truly thrive when they have a sense of purpose and value in their lives. Helping others discover theirs is essential, and models play a key role in this journey. Something we haven't really talked about, have we, is these very strong kind of male role models that we seem to be struggling to identify maybe in society. So that's something I think we can talk about as well, as how we curate that probably better. So
I think
Steve
on the evening we did touch base on positive male role models. We talked about Andrew Tate's being one of these, role models that people have that young men have drifted towards, almost as a counter to some of the sort of leftist movement to where men and their roles should be. I think the issue for young men, and this comment from Steve is absolutely right, is having men with, they need purpose, they need to feel valued, they need to know they're part of something. And in so many ways, I think in relatively recent times, and I'd probably sort of say from potentially around about 2016 onwards, we've sort of lost, maybe because when media was controlled, it was easier to point out who were curated role models, and now anybody can get online and become a role model. But actually, I think the responsibility is for people like us sitting at this table being role models to the group of young people and young men around us. And I often find myself having conversations now about the sense of purpose, and and Steve's absolutely right. When you get them on the right track, they'll give you everything. And I think both Steves are right. We've got neurodivergent people within this business that have been really difficult for us to come to terms with as a general management of these guys. But once you get them around the corner and feeling secure that we're not just going to fire you, you actually get great loyalty and great commitment from these people, and they have a great sense of place. And I find that one of the modern challenges is everybody wants to be part of a community, but being in a part of a community, sometimes sacrificing your own personal goals for those of others. So if we're in a community and it keeps flooding, we're all going to give up our time on our farm to go and build the wall or build the river run that will stop the flooding that's affecting everybody every year. But it's hard. I think it's not natural for people, because I think that community is dissolved around us. And so you live in echo chambers of community now that's online. And actually you need to know that giving to others or giving to the community, isn't a sacrifice of your own being. It's for a greater purpose. And I think that is a challenge. But I do feel, I definitely feel personally a sense of responsibility, not for changing the world, but for influencing positivity about those who are in my immediate vicinity. And I think if everybody took that responsibility of what sometimes becomes very challenging when there has been disappointment or mistakes or being let down, and your senior teams wants you to turn around and go, well, just fire and get rid of him. Did it. And to say, no, actually, we're going to work through this. We've got some mistakes on the book, and these are valuable. I often think the Americans are great at it. The Americans are great at saying, you've been bankrupt, great, you're a safer bet because you know what it feels like to go through that moment.
You felt the pain.
You felt the pain, right? And I often think you have a disaster service and they happen, where everything's gone wrong and you've got tears and everyone's wanting to point the finger and, and try to realize what's gone wrong. And then you think, well, let's just smash it and rebuild it again tomorrow. It's like, no. We've been through that pain. Let's turn this now. This is our opportunity to shape this moment into something positive. And I think that's where you can win these young men who are feeling disillusioned over, because it's about embracing the mistake. It's about embracing the failure and saying, you've got that on your cards now. You're worth more. That's an experience that I need you to hold on to every day. And we often talk about that feeling of nervousness and anxiety. I said that never goes away. I don't think it ever really goes away in anybody's life. But you've got to be able to learn to breathe that into control, into focus, right, and into something positive. And that's I think we're talking about why are men's mental health issues, and why are they feeling so deluded and disillusioned. just talking about it now, there's two things. You know, we're not taking accountability as the Generation X. We're sort of beating them with the old Generation X. We'd be out all day. We've got to take accountability for our mentorship and our leadership with these young people from today, except that we may have mollycoddled them too much and actually put too much safety around them and haven't given them the opportunity to fail the way that we need to. And then reshape, you know, what it is to be a man, you know, to be part of something and to contribute without it not necessarily having to be, you know, I've made £1 million and I've got a million followers. You know, you can still be, you know, this hotel wouldn't function without, you know, Tom Hackworth, our head KP, being here. I'll tell you that right now. You know, like, if he wasn't here, you know, no matter, you know, what you do as a chef, if your pots and pans are dirty and your plates are dirty, or if you're a guest and the bins are filled with rats and other bits and pieces, you know, Tom needs to be reminded just how worthy he's often reminded how worthy he is when he comes in off his holiday and nobody's bloody well done the bins, and then he realises how much value he's got.
It's the same that kind of thing where the role model thing. I think Luke's entirely right. It's about your immediate sphere, and whether you're, you know, if you've got kids, whether you're down on the sideline of the football pitch or whether you're, I don't know, whatever. It's if you can positively impact one person or a small group of people, then that's a small step forward. And, you know, we will all know the weird little moments where someone has stepped in to be of help or a guide or a little course correct. And at the time it was nothing, but actually now that you're older, you look back and think, oh my God, I really remember that as being a thing. We should take that as, that could be us. We could be those male role models who are just nudging maybe, and or rather than say that it's this or don't act like that, it's more, and maybe that's then that little kind of catalyst, and seeing that of equal value to, you know, the £1 million online thing that's going on. They're both of equal value.
I think the way I see it, Steve, I mean, you're a coach, you do the NLP, and very much in a coaching role is about asking questions, isn't it? It's about asking the right questions. So if we're sort of talking about having an entity represented by, let's say, a group of elders who can translate that wisdom down to younger generations, it should be done in a way where we're asking questions. And not that this is the way things should be. This is not the way that they live their lives. It should be very much around empathy, asking questions, seeing what's going to work for them, as opposed to, because again, our lived experience is not their lived experience. So things that we've grown up with, they have no clue. You know, they've no idea what it is to grow up without a mobile phone or the internet. They have no concept.
50% of them won't even have a dad. Divorce rates are 50%. So you've got the fracturing of the family unit there.
Yeah,
I think it's very destabilizing for young people these days.
And this is why, going back to your point, sorry to interrupt, John, of the Andrew Tate's, Luke, that you mentioned, is that his existence is because he's moved into the void.
Sure.
Yeah.
And when you think about this, the frictionless way in which he exists is because what he's saying speaks to that disconnect. The young guys, I mean, my youngest is 24, and he went through a phase of almost championing this guy. And now he's completely the opposite because his maturity has grown, but he's moved into a vacuum. And he's able to do that because of the disconnect, of the disenfranchised element of it. And it seems to be there's more friction of having an entity like a group of elders that could move into that void. Because, you know, we need to be relevant. Andrew Tate is relevant, and he knows that. Donald Trump speaks the language of the common American. He's become relevant. if we don't speak the language of who we're trying to talk to, you'll just be dismissed. So all of this wisdom, all of this knowledge, all of this life that we've all lived as people of our generation, disseminated down, needs to be done in such a way that resonates and that can be seen to be an attractive prospect to move towards, as opposed to being dictatorial and saying, because it was like this in our day, that it absolutely has to be like this for you. And it's an awareness
I think as
piece.
well with the, you're absolutely right that, you know, with the breakdown of marriage, you know, not being tantamount, and the fact that there was an element of shame of divorcing. It kept people together through harder times. So you would see a little bit more grit and determination, and the fact that things didn't always work out and faded.
But they didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice.
No, and not that I'm a religious guy, but you remove religion, you remove marriage, you know, you do create the void. And you're absolutely right. Who's coming in there and fulfilling these positive role models without just sounding like, well, back in my day, we used to do it like this. And trying to create, I like the way you've worded that, a group of elders, you know, because we're all so much more spread out now. Is there, you saw it with the intellectual dark web, you know, when, you know, in the early days of Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and you know, that type of movement where, you know, people were looking for guidance in, you know, in society and motivation, and finding YouTubers to sort of, or social media people to be able to sort of bring a little bit of a moral compass to you, you know, that it wasn't necessarily just in your sphere that you're sat around, and where do you find that purpose. And you know, we talked about on the day, there was a lady who asked, you know, is social media, and should we take the phones away from the kids? Is social media responsible, and should we take the phones away from the kids? Well, I think, you know, I concluded on that night to myself that horse has bolted, you know, but maybe there is control about the algorithms to under 16-year-olds that could be better curated. So we're not necessarily getting porn, gambling, fast cars, watches, and all this other stuff feeding into these young people's streams and keeping them in these sort of narrow echo chambers of voices, and trying to bring in more gatekeeping with the algorithms that they can have on access to their phones, so they're filled with more positivity and connectivity. But it's not easy.
Yeah, and we're sort of posing this as somehow as a young person's issue. Like, we're all over 40, and this is far from a young person's issue, especially with the change in the job market now. You're going to maybe have to reinvent yourself every 2-3 years, aren't you? You can be, you know, jobs for life are pretty much game over. Businesses are extremely hard. If any of you have obviously running your own business, people know how volatile they can be. Like we said, with relationships, men struggle more than women after divorces statistically. So, you know, a lot of guys getting divorced 40s, 50s, maybe not having as much access to their children, ill health, that type of thing. So this is not a young person's issue, is it, guys?
No. And I think that's the kind of the perenniality of life, isn't it? Like, whatever's happening now is what's happening now. Life is going to happen, and whether you get the curveball or the curveballs now, or whether they happen over time, is, you know, it's just the luck of the draw. And it's not just a young person's issue at all.
Yeah, but nobody escapes. So what are we excited for, guys? And what to leave on a positive note, if we're speaking to guys out there about mental health and trying to improve your situation, what advice would you give to somebody if you're sort of speaking to your younger self, let's say?
Well, for me in particular, you know, my awareness of, rather than standing on principle and saying, you know, I can't deal with all of this mental health, it's all a load of nonsense, people just need to grow a pair and get on with it. I've realized actually opening up to neurodiversity and my understanding of it, and realizing that some people just take longer to learn something, or it's more difficult for them to conceive this or conceptualize it, and having more faith. You know, I run the kitchen now on, empathy, consideration, and patience. You know, those sort of cornerstones of what we're going to build from. I think has given me great hope that there is a place. Now, I get white collar workers are sort of going to be on the ropes a little bit in the short term as AI takes over those jobs. But I feel quite empowered that we're still a hands and heart industry that's human to human, and it's going to grow in. And all of a sudden, our moment in the sunshine might just be coming. It might not just be, the uneducated fools that, that visual learning and hands-on heart. I'm sure at some point we'll be teaching the robots how to do it. But for now, there is hope, and there is a place that within hospitality that keeps humans interacting with humans and can accept neurodiversity, and also has that old adage saying of busy hands, quiet mind. It's a good environment for people whose brains can't stop, to keep them occupied.
I agree. And Steve, words of wisdom, Steve. Come on, pressure's on you, sir.
I think kind of to go back to the title, the truth on men's mental health is that the more men talk about men's mental health and what's going on in their brains, speaking from vast quantities of experience, the better men's mental health will be. And, the ability to get online and just talk about it is a great step forward. And it does take a tremendous amount to decide that you are going to open up or share a thing, the little drop that then releases the flood that is all going on inside of your head. But it takes a lot to release that first little bit. And as soon as you start to do that, the better your mental health will always end up being. That's the worst bit. Once you're over the worst bit, which is a nonsense, but it is what it is, we've all decided in our heads. Once you're over the worst bit, the rest of it is just better because you just get to talk. It won't necessarily change anything, but the picture that you have of it in your head, and therefore the feelings that creates inside of you, changes. And that's powerful. And it just comes from a couple of minutes of an initial conversation, and it can and you'll always take something away from it, whether you're the person who's offloading or you're the person who's been given the privilege of listening to it. I think that's the truth about men's mental health is you've just got to start to talk in some way, shape, or form with whomever it is. And once you start, then your mental health you will feel better about yourself and what's going on around you, for sure.
I like that, Steve. James, you've got a little word of wisdom, and we've got another quick. We have Steve again. I find myself concerned for young men today. They've grown up in a society where the narrative has increasingly focused on empowering women and addressing women's issues, which is undeniably important. However, through media and social media, many young men are exposed to a portrayal of masculinity that is often framed as either toxic or fragile. Yeah. This one-sided perspective has left a void, making figures like Andrew Tate appealing to those searching for a sense of identity or validation. The universe seems like a bit of a balancing act, doesn't it, guys? I think you can just swing from one extreme to another. So, in our society, normally the extremes hit the newspapers or the TV because it sells advertising space. It's not every guy wants to be a trans, or it's not like immigration's completely taking over. you know, some things, even like with male suicide, 99.9% of men don't commit suicide. It's still higher in men, but we can all play with figures to make things sound worse than they actually are. And, you know, people like Andrew Tate, he knows how to play the game. You know, he says a lot of good stuff hidden with stuff that's, you know, an extreme version of our society, isn't it? So we're living for a revolution, guys. So I would say to people, just maybe give yourself a little bit of a break. You know, things are changing so fast. You're going to be a long time dead. Anything that you think's bad passes. Everything that you think is going to be good is never as good as you thought it was going to be. That's what I've always found in my life. It's never as bad or as good as you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
I think time moves fast, doesn't it, guys? Before you know it, you're grey, you're bald, and, you know, your wife's left you. It's the way it goes.
Well, I got 2 of those. Final word from me. I think there's a popular misconception that men don't talk to each other. Well, I absolutely believe they do, given the right environment. So really, I think we've all got to create the right environment that we can talk to each other, where we feel safe, secure, and not feel that we're going to be judged as a result. So if we can create environments like that, I think that there's some hope.
I like that, guys. No, I appreciate you guys coming on to share your insights. You know, I don't know anything about the hospitality area. Obviously, it's fast moving. You've got a lot of interactions with a lot of different people, I can imagine.
It's
so it's very diverse, isn't it, in that area? Very high octane, you know, on the edge business with, you know, sometimes thin margins. So I guess it's quite a hectic,
not sometimes, very thin margins. Paper thin margins in this day and age.
Yeah, so you push anyone to the edge and you're going to see, you know, different parts of their character. People can, you know, look relaxed if they're working in a florist. You know, you put them in a kitchen and it's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? So,
sure.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you coming on, guys. Great to have you. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to Steve for your comments, and any other comments, just put them on the comment section, and we'll have a look.
We will get back to you
that for you guys. So where can everyone find you guys? Where's the best place to go? Luke, you're at the most beautiful hotel in the world, aren't you? Serving the best
one of them
that's ever been.
Limewood Hotel in the New Forest. Come down and see us. You know, we're cooking up some nice stuff, not too poncy, but a beautiful environment to sit and relax.
Beautiful.
Yep.
Steve, we can find you on the coast somewhere sailing your yacht. Is that right?
Yeah. So New Forest based, but yes, currently looking for a new role. So you'll find me on LinkedIn quite a lot.
Good man.
All right.
Okay, then, guys, have a fantastic day, and we'll see you
very much
afterwards. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Much appreciated.
Bye.